Join C-SPAN as Wu Zhexian, the Foreign Minister of the People's Republic of China, speaks before the National Press Club in Washington. His speech, entitled Safeguarding World Peace, will address recent reforms and examine China's internal affairs. Saturday, March 12th at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific Time on C-SPAN.
Next on C-SPAN, our special Election 88 preview continues as we take you to Miami, Florida, for a campaign appearance by Vice President George Bush. During a campaign stop in that city today, the Vice President discussed foreign policy issues before an audience gathered at Florida International University.
Please join me all in giving a warm welcome to our distinguished guest lecturer in international relations this morning, the Honorable George P. Bush, Vice President of the United States of America.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Thank you all. Where's Bobby? Glad to see you. Thank you very, very much. Well, thank you, Mr. President. And before we get started, I brought a little assistance along with me. Oh, Congressman, how are you? One of the most distinguished senior statesmen, he'll kill me for saying that, also a professor, I might add, at Arizona State, the Honorable Barry Goldwater. This is a government lecture, but let me just make some comments here and then take questions. I heard the professor getting this audience fired up, and I hope you will ask the tough questions. Sorry, I won't have time to debate him because I think we might come down differently on some of these issues. But that's what this is all about. And I'm glad to be here and, of course, honored to have Senator Goldwater at my side. And if later on we get in the Q's and the A's and you wanted to fire a question at him, why, he knows how to either avoid, dodge, or answer the question like the rest of us in politics. But let me just make some general comments on government. We do ask a lot of our presidents. Stability in a crisis, knowledge and personal skills to deal with friends and foes and adversaries alike around the world. And really, I think foreign affairs, the national security is the #1 responsibility of the president. And then I think as we got into the election here, the conviction and the vision. I don't know whether I need this other mic here. Does turn that one off and work with this one? But the job description is commander-in-chief. A lot of other responsibilities, and the president mentioned them, education and others, no question. But the job description, you start with national security and being commander-in-chief. I've had some experience in dealing with the Soviets. First started in 1971 when I was ambassador at the United Nations. I remember meeting Mr. Gromyko many times there. And there's a lot of speculation about change in the Soviet Union. Now, there is some change going on. Glasnost, openness, perestroika reform. But there is no change, in my view, in fundamental direction. And when Gromyko, then foreign minister, now really almost a kind of a pro forma position, he said this about Mr. Gorbachev. He said, "Comrades, this man has a nice smile, but he's got iron teeth." And I think as we shape the policy of the United States government, whoever is president in the future, I think that's good advice to keep in mind. Take it as a warning. When we came into office 8 years ago, we found a weakened defense. 7 years later, the defense has been built. We have hung tough with the Soviets. You know and I know that our president got an awful lot of criticism 3 or 4 years ago when he called the evil empire, and people said, well, this shows he doesn't know how to deal with the Soviet Union. Wrong. That's totally wrong in my view. And by being strong, by rebuilding the muscle of this country, we have now achieved the first agreement in the nuclear age that eliminates an entire category of nuclear weapons. And that's good national security, and that's good for our own country, and I think it's good for the alliance, because it is verifiable. And you go back and look at the arms control agreements, and I expect you've been studying them. All they've done up to now is limit how fast you can build these atomic weapons. So now that's been reversed, and I think it's good. And I think if we continue to keep this country strong, and it's going to be a fight in the future for strong defense, I think we can make progress on strategic arms reductions, on conventional arms reductions, and that's got to be priority now, and the President will be talking about that in about 24 hours from now in Brussels with our NATO allies, and also on the elimination of chemical and biological weapons. Barry's had a lot of contact with Margaret Thatcher, and so have I, and one of her great priorities, she told me the last time, was the elimination of chemical and biological weapons. Her dramatic example was, if we don't do something about this, the pilots couldn't even have time to get into the airplanes. And it is an awesome thing, and it's very hard to accommodate, incidentally. I put the treaty on the table in Geneva to ban these weapons, but it's hard to get it done because of the verification. And so we've got to press and try to build on the verification regime in the INF, but that would not be good enough to reach, in my view, a conventional weapons accord. And so I think the bottom line in negotiation with the Soviets is talk with our adversaries, air the differences across the table, but never go to bargain from a position of weakness, and I never would do that. We should never allow our arms control ambitions to compromise our values. We got to stand for the principles of our own history and our own heritage. And we've got to remember that the interests of the world and the cause of peace are not served simply by the status quo, the containment of Marxist aggression, but rather by the spreading of freedom and democracy. And I'm very pleased that 90% of the people in our hemisphere now live under some form of democracy. Some struggling to keep the democratic system, some struggling to perfect it, and some having been blessed by democracy for a long, long time. There are some obvious exceptions to this trend towards democracy, and we all know who they are. I am very proud that we took action in Grenada. It's hard to turn things around, but when those American students were at risk and the Caribbean countries asked us to go there, we did, and kicking Castro out of Grenada was a very good thing, and it offered hope to a tiny little country that now is a fledgling little democracy over there. I'm proud that we've done our utmost to support the Contras, and I am disturbed when the Congress pulls the plug out from under the President of the United States. I'm absolutely convinced you'd have no negotiation if we hadn't kept the pressure on the Sandinistas, because I cannot think of an example in history where a Marxist government that oppresses, and this one has failed to live up to its commitment to the Organization of American States, is willing to go the democratic route without pressure. There's just no examples of that in history. And so I want to see that pressure kept on, and I regret that Congress has taken the action they've taken. It's not a question of right versus left, liberal or conservative. It's right versus wrong. And by cutting off the military aid there, Congress has abandoned the course that brought the Sandinistas to the bargaining table in the first place. The struggle, as another point, is the struggle between the executive and the legislative branches over foreign policy. Have you been touching that? I'm sure you've been touching on in your classes, because you can't look at foreign policy and government without getting caught up one way or another in this dilemma that we face. Barry Goldwater came to Washington in a different era. I don't want to date the guy, but we were talking about it today, when men and women on both sides of the aisles work together. And Senator Vandenberg's comments. Sure, you remember that from history. Quote, when the nation's security is at stake, partisanship stops at the water's edge. And we gotten away from that. That was the time of Pax Americana, Democrats and Republicans joining together to meet the challenge of communism on the march. In a time of the Truman Doctrine, a time when we reached out with a Marshall Plan to lift up adversary and friend alike. Brutalization of the war in Europe being set aside and picking people up. The giants of the era gone. Richard Russell and Mendel Rivers from up in South Carolina, Carl Vinson, powerful congressional leaders committed to protecting our national interests who knew how to make the system work. In our foreign policy today, it's fractured. Congress is fractured, and it's fractious. And leadership is rare, and partisanship is common. There are 23 committees, 84 subcommittees, claiming some jurisdiction over international affairs, and each of them jockeying for a piece of the action, each of them vying to be Secretary of State. We don't need 84 Secretaries of State. We have one, empowered to act by the President of the United States. And Congress has enacted statutes that regulate our foreign policy in the most minute details. At the time, there was big support for the War Powers Resolution, but today I'm convinced that that would not pass, even in a fractious, divided Congress of this nature. In the War Powers Resolution, Congress claims the power to act by concurrent resolution, and that's without presidential approval. And this the Supreme Court rejected as unconstitutional in the Chadha decision. Congress does have a role in foreign policy. I've been in the Congress, and I respect the Congress's role. But Hamilton spoke in the Federalist Papers of the need to focus foreign policy in one man so that the nation could act quickly, decisively, and if necessary, secretly, to achieve our goals abroad. And John Marshall spoke of the President as the sole organ of the nation in its external relations and its sole representatives with foreign nations. We've had enormous change since then. In the past 200 years, we've sent troops overseas 200 times without a declaration of war, each time to protect our national interests and our national security. And should the need arise, you got to be sensitive to the regions. The last thing we ought to do in Central America, for example, is send troops there. We're living down macho Yankee imperialism. But the ability, should the need arise, the national security interests of the United States of America, then they should do it again. And I certainly would not hesitate to do that, to act under the presidential power. Vermont Royster, the editor emeritus of the Wall Street Journal, reviewed some of those executive actions and concluded, in nearly every case, had the president gone to Congress for the authority to do what he did, the result had been a long, drawn-out political battle. And in some cases, if the president had won congressional approval, it would have come too late to make the action effective or even possible. A couple of examples. Jimmy Carter was asked to tell by some senators that he should give an advance notice of a covert action. He had Desert One in mind. Desert One, an action taken to try to free the people that were held hostage in Iran. And I supported that. And I think the president was right then to resist this prior notice, because I don't think you would have even I don't think the operation would have gotten off in the first place. The Grenada operation, I was the one that had the responsibility to have the two meetings leading up to it, a room full of military people and civilians, whoever had authority there, go right around the room asking them why they were there, what they were doing, keep it secret. And then we notified the leaders of Congress just before it took place, and the action came off without leaks that could have risked the lives of American men and women. And so you have to be able to act, it seems to me, in certain situations. The 1964 edition of the congressional publication called Legislation on Foreign Affairs was a single 650-page volume. By the middle of the 80s, that had grown to 3 volumes of more than 1,000 pages each. And I guess what I'm saying is the erosion of presidential power is dangerous to ourselves. It's confusing to foe and friend alike. And last year, as the Senate considered another restriction, Senator Danforth of Missouri put it this way. He said, "I'd submit that no reasonable person anywhere in the world can predict how the United States stands on any foreign policy issue." And so the challenge that we face, and that you'll face when you get out of school and hopefully actively involved in one way or another, some of you in foreign policy, is one that is to find this middle ground, a cooperative middle ground, one that respects the constitutional role of the legislative branch and yet leaves the executive branch free to respond quickly and decisively. The best way to deal with our adversaries, and there are some out there, don't mistake the longest peace in Europe for the fact we have no adversaries. The best way to deal with them is to stay united. And so, a personal word, if I am elected, I would like to find a way to encourage a new bipartisanship in foreign policy. The Congress has got to tighten up its own internal discipline, reform the committee structure. I know Senator Goldwater and I both support one committee on intelligence. I think it would get into, like the old Joint Atomic Energy Commission, it would get into more disclosure. It would get into more cooperation between the executive branch and the legislative branch, and it would be much less likely to put the lives of men and women at risk who are involved in necessary, properly found covert action. And so congressional reform is a subject that you'll be hearing a lot about in the future. I think that I'm not pessimistic about this, but I do think we're going to have to see some changes in the Congress and its procedures and its actions before we reach the millennium or before we can possibly move back towards the Vandenberg days. But that Vandenberg objective of bipartisanship, of partisanship stopping at the water's edge is very, very good. And so I wanted to share those thoughts with you, and I'll be glad now to respond to questions. Hey.
Yes, Alexander Haig earlier during the campaign said that the INF agreement in fact had weakened the Western alliance. And in the past, the Europeans have had a habit of, when we have weapons in Europe, they're paranoid that we're going to use them first, and when we don't have them in Europe, they're paranoid that we will let the Russians invade them.
Yeah.
What would be your answer to that?
My view is Alexander Haig is wrong, and voters confirmed that opinion. And I would simply say, look, there's reasonable room for debate on the INF Treaty. No question about that. If we sat there and were unwilling to vigorously negotiate to correct the conventional force imbalance, there'd be much more reason to be concerned. As you know what happened on the INF Treaty. Soviets take out 1,600 warheads, we take out 400. We've established a principle of asymmetrical reductions. We've had a breakthrough on verification. If you'd have told me when I was at the UN, say, or running the CIA in the 70s that we would have this kind of intrusive verification, I'd have said, no way. So there's some improvement there. But we can't stop here. And the people that are worried most about this are the Germans now. And the president will be shoring this up. All the alliance leaders support this. And in my view, you'll hear unanimous support coming out of the NATO summit tomorrow for the INF Treaty. But what you won't hear are the subcurrents of concern. And one of the subcurrents of concern is Germany's vulnerability. And so what I think we have to do is vigorously follow on with a conventional force agreement that uses that principle of asymmetry. They take out more than we do. Why? Because they got many more of them. So you try to get a more stable number at lower numbers and more stability there. Push for chemical and biological weapons, and then not be afraid to go forward with a strategic arms deal, which really reduces, particularly if you get the emphasis on the SS-18s, on the intercontinental ballistic missiles, the most destabilizing of all. Europe is not going to insist on separation of the START agreement from a conventional force agreement. So, you know, with respect, Al Haig knows this subject, but I just think that the Joint Chiefs are right, I think the President's right, I think the NATO leaders are right when they support the INF Treaty. Sir.
Vice President, you mentioned that the struggle that we're dealing with is not a left versus right, but a right versus wrong. And you talk about, you know, the kind of resistance that the United States has put up to the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and Castro in Cuba. What I would like to know is why hasn't more resistance been put up to the right-wing oppression of people like Pinochet in Chile and apartheid and the Israeli persecution of the Palestinians, and what you can do about that if you become president?
I think you raise a good point. You raise a good point. One difference has been the concept of the export and support of revolution. The Nicaraguans called it a revolution without borders. Pinochet does not threaten Argentina or his neighbors. So there's a difference there. But there isn't a moral difference in terms of lack of respect for human rights, whether it's there, whether it's in South Africa with the horror of apartheid, or wherever it is. But I think the reason is that from neighbors and others is when they feel that they are about to be destabilized by the revolution itself, by the goals of Marxist expansionism. But I think in terms of morality, that the United States has to stand up against totalitarians of the right or the left. And so we have a moral position on human rights. But I think the reason I gave you is the reason why sometimes there's more concern expressed about those who try to subvert their neighbors, as Nicaragua clearly was doing in El Salvador. And El Salvador knows this. They're very concerned about it. They have had certifiably free elections, and yet they know that they're have been subverted, or attempts to subvert them, coming out of the expansionist side of it. Got to shift to the other part of the world for a minute. For years, China, mainland China, supported and exported revolution. Little credential here: I lived in China, and they supported and exported. Now there is still support for the fraternal brothers. And so the radio broadcasts still go out of China to Thailand and Malaysia and Indonesia, fraternal support for the Communist Party. But the export of revolution is definitively down if it exists. And that's why you're seeing those countries like Indonesia and these others in Singapore, who would have nothing to do with them, changing their views a little, and they're still a Marxist regime. And so I think you've got to also take a hard look at foreign policy on how these Marxist regimes are exporting or supporting revolution, or totalitarians of the right, are they doing that too? That's the other ingredient that goes with the moral ingredient of the United States being the ones to stand up for human rights. Yay.
I'm speaking from China, and just now you mentioned China, but in your speech, and I didn't hear anything about you talking about the policy, foreign policy towards China and Sino-American relationship. So would you like to talk a few main points? For example, the human rights in Tibet, and also the Chinese and trade with Americans, something like the textile quota and something.
Good. Where are you from in China?
I'm from Guangzhou.
Guangzhou?
Yeah, next to Hong Kong.
Yes, I've been there many times. I think this relationship with China is a very important relationship. You know and I know the one stumbling block to totally normalize relations. And that's when Mao Zedong said it's going to take 1, 10, or 100 years, and that's the question of Taiwan. And the United States has a Shanghai Communique that guides our policy with China, which we support, and that's the doctrine, and we will support it, but we also have a commitment to the people on Taiwan. And the United States has no role, it seems to me, I know one time and another we get feelers from both sides to do something about that. In my view, it should take the talks between the countries themselves to do something. And I am not pessimistic. You see more trade now between, some of it's kind of via third party, via Hong Kong or something, between China and Taiwan. I am one who also feels that the monolith that we used to think was communism in the 1950s, where Khrushchev and Mao Zedong were like this, doesn't exist. They still are Marxist-Leninist state. Your country is, and so is the Soviet Union. But they're here. They're at loggerheads. Hundreds of thousands of troops pinned down on both borders And the United States ought not to be trying to play a China card or play a Soviet card, but what we should do is keep our commitments in Asia. We should develop our relationship with China, and it is developing it. Look, in the last 10 years, there's a dramatic change. American businessmen go over there and see it, cultural exchanges, and there's the Chinese people. My heavens, if there ever was a people proud of their history and their culture and their really freedom, it's the people of China. So you got to know on these relationships, you got to know how to handle them. You got to look for the strategic interest of the United States, and the last thing in the strategic interest of the United States would be for China to get back in bed with the Soviet Union as it used to be in the 50s. In my view, that is not going to happen. But we should have enough knowledge of foreign policy to do what we can to see that it doesn't. But you don't have to sell out friends in the process. And once you do that, and I think the Chinese officials understand that that's the way we look at Taiwan, once you do that, you diminish moral posture of the United States and other places in the world. So bottom line, it is a very important relationship. It wasn't mentioned in the speech because I was dwelling on that other subject, but it is one that I think as we go forward, the relationship will get better. In Taiwan, incidentally, you have a native Taiwanese that for the first time is president of the government there. And you have more exchanges and you have more things going back and forth. So let your country, Taiwan, work out this problem of China. And let the United States be enough aware of the strategic relationships and then also enough grateful for the kind of cultural exchanges and trade we've got to develop and handle a relationship properly. But if I were you, I don't see anything on the horizon that would diminish the relationship between your country and ours. I hope not. And I would be working that it didn't happen. And I think it can fit very nicely into the future of the United States with Asia. It is so important. We sometimes neglect the Pacific Rim. Yeah.
We have time
yes,
for
ma'am.
One more question, Mr. President.
I'm sorry I've been filibustering, but I get wound up. That's a subject that interests me very, very much.
I'd like to know, what specifically are you going to do for South Florida relating to the drugs coming in?
Well, as you know, we have a drug interdiction program. And I see one of the great leaders of Miami here, Armando Codina, who came to Washington a few years ago with Alva Chapman, who's head of the newspaper here, and Frank Borman, and maybe one other, and said, look, we need some help from the federal government in the interdiction of drugs. And we set up the South Florida Task Force. And the South Florida Task Force did a good job in interdiction. We changed the laws so that military assets can be used to cooperate in the interdiction of drugs. That's what they call the Posse Comitatus laws. We've used the Coast Guard, working in hand with the Navy, as a matter of fact. Coast Guard officers on naval vessels to interdict. And so we've made progress. We've interdicted tons of narcotics coming in here. But as Barry Goldwater told me coming down on the plane, he says, look, just not far from where he lives, we have a porous border. We have a porous shoreline on the United States. And I don't care if you blockade the United States. As long as you have the demand, they're going to get this insidious narcotics in here. The cost of doing business, one airplane. Bring it, land it, Barry telling me this today, and leave it. Forget it only cost $100,000. It's nothing compared to the profit. Since when we first came into office, 2 countries were cooperating in spraying of narcotics. Now there are 20. But the net is porous. Coast Guard needs more support. But we are not going to solve the problem solely through interdiction. And let me just tell you something. We're getting into the political time of year. And you're going to hear all kinds of flamboyant. I heard some Democrat from New York on the television this morning berating everything. He's not willing to look at the record. He's not willing to think of the lives lost, like Mr. Rios right here in Miami, who gave his life trying to fight these insidious narcotics. He's not looking at the fact that it was this administration that's using military assets and has set up a radar defense, these radar balloons. And he's not willing to look at reality. And the reality is, regrettably, that as long as you have demand, you're going to have some way to get this insidious stuff into this country. So the answer to your question, both. An improved, tightened net on interdiction, and, you know, there's not just limitless money out there. You want more money for Pell Grants? You want money for guaranteed student loans? You want more money to work-study programs? Want more money like I do for a program to help families save money by a break on interest so that when the kid gets 18, the family will have saved enough money to send him to college? I think we all want those things. But we got to sort out the priorities. There isn't a higher priority in terms of the national security, you might say, and health of the nation, but it's an allocation of resource problem. And so we're doing pretty well, not near well enough. But I salute the cooperation that we've gotten right here in Miami from the local police, the state police, DEA, FBI, whatever it is, Customs, Coast Guard, Navy, all of these services pulling together for the first time in history. And yet this insidious stuff is still coming in and polluting and threatening the lives of the kids in the grade schools. So we've